class. It really gets into the story of the discovery. So largely what I want to do is talk about why this is such a big deal, kind of a little bit about these two different men who came up with these ideas, but also just what evolution is in the first place. So, because our class is called, the United Kingdom, the birthplace of modern geology, it's good to know that in some ways, a lot of the things that were going on at this time were also dealing with the birth of modern biology as we understand it, because evolution is one of the central theories, central ideas in all of the biological sciences. So I want to dig into that. So a bit about the discovery of the origins of species. This is a photocopy from Darwin's first edition, well, actually from one of his notebooks, where he very famously says, "I think," and then starts to draw a tree, some kind of tree of life, where he has this idea that, we understand to be true today, but he was developing this idea that, okay, we have these organisms and then they branch. So we have, adaptations, natural selection going on, which we'll get into, and they change into different species over time. And he was able to discover that largely because of where he was studying this stuff. He was looking at islands, and island biogeography and island evolution is very rapid. So he was in Wallace too. He was in a different location, but between the two of them, they were in some of the very best laboratories in the world to understand evolution and actually see direct evidence for it. But let's go back a little bit further. So Darwin and, to an extent, Wallace are well known for coming up with the ideas of natural selection, which would enable us to understand evolution. Well, that means, and we have this understanding that evolution was already something pretty well accepted by the time Darwin got on the scene. Darwin didn't invent evolution. He didn't come up with the first ideas on evolution. What he did was something that all scientists need to do in order to get an idea, no matter how much evidence there is for it, but an idea accepted well enough to be considered a scientific theory. He needed to demonstrate how evolution happens. So let's go back before Darwin and think about some evidence that other scientists were coming up with for evolution before Darwin was even around. So we can go back. We're looking at people that are studying fossils, so paleontologists, anatomists, mostly doctors and surgeons. They've noticed a lot of trends in the organisms that they were studying that were made them think, well, maybe these guys are related. We have a lot of the same bones that make us up. We have, there's a hierarchy, and the fact that Linnaeus was able to even put life on in kind of that tree of life, which his version isn't terribly accurate or super useful nowadays, but the fact that he was able to make a hierarchy of kingdom, phylum, class, order, all these things, kind of meant that we have a bit of a branching system going on, that everything kind of nests into a bigger group. Surgeons had known about this for a while. Anyone who studied, any obstetrician was able to understand that little fetuses of humans look a lot like fetuses of other animals. Like in this example, we have a bird, we have a reptile, we have a fish, and at certain stages in their development, they look a lot like these other organisms. So humans actually do have gill slits way back early on in development. Humans have tails pretty early on in development, and some humans are even born with tails too. The doctor just kind of snips that off, doesn't always tell the parents about it. It's just something that happens sometimes. You may have been born with one, I don't know. But this is something that, because there were some images that were done that were not the most accurate, like Ernst Haeckel made some images. This is something that creationists like to really jump on and say, oh, well, there's this whole problem with it. The truth is, though, this whole idea of embryology and how organisms are very similar at different stages of their growth is a fundamental idea in all of embryology. So we're not, when we're thinking about evolution, yeah, maybe this was something Darwin was looking at. But nowadays, of course, we're not studying drawings of fetuses from the 1820s, 1830s to come up with ideas of evolution. We're actually studying, of course, modern day embryos and embryology and birth defects and all that. It's a huge, super hot field of research right now. So yeah, we see that at a certain point, humans do have gill slits. We have gill arches. So we don't use them for breathing in the uterus or anything like that. It's a remnant from our ancestors, and lots of animals that don't have gills once they're born have these too. So anyway, some really neat things. Another example was vestigial organs, anything that kind of isn't really used today, like our appendix is kind of a good example. Our appendix probably does have some uses we're not really too familiar with. The tail, humans that are born with tails, that could definitely be considered a vestigial organ. We can also call those atavisms, kind of things that are kind of a throwback to our ancestry. We're also looking at, there's some really good examples as we talk about whales later, and you guys have a Stated Clearly video that I have a link for you. Really great about the evidence for evolution, and gets into whales in particular, because whales are a very cool story on how we understand what we understand about how evolution works. But they have a pretty major vestigial organ, and that is going to be a vestigial body part, and that's going to be a femur and a hip. They actually have, a pelvis, and some of them have like a little femur and all sorts of little features indicating that their ancestors had legs, walked on land. But of course, whales don't have that today. Snakes, same thing. Snakes are often born with little hind legs that are kind of weird. So anyway, lots of different bits and pieces of evolution I've understood again before Darwin. So we're also looking at, we talked about William Stratus Smith and how he came up with this. Well, he kind of tied together a lot of bits of evidence to come up with the idea that fossils change over time. He was using ammonites in England to draw a very nice, accurate map of England. But most importantly, I guess he was understanding that fossils change over time. We're going from, and this is a way oversimplification, isn't really the case today, but he realized that we're going from more simple life to more and more complex life, and fossils change as we go higher and higher into younger and younger rock. So people had understood that for a while. That's what faunal succession in the rock record means, that organisms change. That's pretty big. We also see lots of intermediate forms, though Darwin wasn't really lucky enough to get to study many of them. One of the most famous ones is Archaeopteryx, the first bird. May or may not be a real bird, the first bird as we know now, but at the time it was very special, but it wasn't discovered until after Darwin wrote Origin of Species. Now we have loads of intermediate forms. Tiktaalik is a perfect one, Eusthenopteron, Panderichthys, all those guys are kind of showing us the fish to tetrapod thing. All sorts of little feathered toothed dinosaurs that are very birdy. But where do you draw the line? Where does it stop being a non-avian dinosaur and begin to be an actual true bird? And that gets really fuzzy, but the species are not fixed things. Like we learn about this in school, like, oh, a species is an organism that, it can't reproduce with something of another species. That's not really true. Polar bears and grizzlies can produce offspring that can also produce, and they look very, very different from one another. And so there's really no agreed on definition of a species. What we learned about in grade school is not really accurate. It doesn't really apply to real life. So species are apparently, and Darwin was one of the first to kind of realize this, they're pretty plastic. They change, and they change with pretty easily. So anyway, this, as we just outlined some other evidence. An extinction and occurrence of new species. Okay, back to the rock record. I think this is a really cool one that doctors were starting to look at. They were realizing that, as we look at something like the flipper of a whale, if you were going to say, hey, I'm going to take this animal and make it swim and design some kind of flipper, you wouldn't do it this way. You wouldn't draw see if I can use a pen here. It seems pretty cool. Oh, yeah. You wouldn't do that. Why do you have fingers? Why does the whale need fingers? It doesn't need fingers, and those are not necessarily helpful. You would probably make just a big flat probably something kind of flexible, but kind of a flattish type of structure of bone. Well, that might be a better design, but that's not what the whale has to work with. Evolution can only work with what is already there. So the whale is limited by its ancestry to have a flipper that is made up of 4 or 5 fingers, just like its ancestors had. Same thing with the bat. Sorry, wish I could kind of move that, but okay. The bat's wing is like a hand. So basically those fingers in green and blue are elongated. They're stretched out. So bats fly with their entire hand, kind of being stretched out like that. But yeah, with a human's arm and a cat's leg, you're seeing a lot of similarities. All tetrapods have this pattern of 1 bone with the humerus here, 2 bones with our radius and ulna, wrists, many bones, and then finally fingers. So even if you're a whale, if you're a bat, even if you're a bird, you know, if you're a tetrapod, vertebrate animal, then you're limited by this pattern. So anything your arm comes up with, whether it's climbing or flying or walking or swimming, has this basic pattern. Now you might lose a couple toes, right? Horses only have 1 toe, but you know, this is in our ancestry. You can't really change this. We're limited by, you know, what evolution can do, what genes can do. So the guys that we're talking about are Darwin and Wallace. So Charles Robert Darwin, and I've got pictures of them, or paintings of them from the time period where they were making their big discoveries, not from when they were older and gray haired and all that. And Alfred Russel Wallace at the bottom. So young men out on ships, traveling the world, collecting specimens, and they came from some pretty different backgrounds. Darwin was actually training to be a geologist. One of his mentors was someone else we talked about in this class called Adam Sedgwick. He was a geology professor, and Darwin was working under him. But he didn't really like geology a whole lot after helping to describe a new fossil called a Toxodon, sorry. He was trained to be a priest at some point. If we go further back, he was actually training to be a surgeon, but couldn't handle the surgery rooms because, well, I mean, there was no anesthesia. So he passed out when he saw a child having its some limb amputated. Just, you know, no anesthesia, nothing like that. I can't even imagine what that'd be like. So he didn't know what he was going to do. But he was asked to travel along as a naturalist on a ship called the Beagle. So he did, HMS Beagle, sorry, Her Majesty's ship, the HMS Beagle, and they went all around the world around the same time, a little bit later, I think. Wallace was doing something similar. He was on a ship. He was going to many different parts of the world too, mostly the Malay archipelago, so Indonesia. So they were in different parts of the world, but they were studying islands, and they were studying very exotic, very warm parts of the world. Turns out they were studying things that, I mean, these were just perfect laboratories to study evolution. Very, very, they couldn't have been in a better location, it turns out. So the cool thing about when we are developing an idea in science, and when we're trying to determine if it's a good idea or not, is when people or lines of research that are very, very different from one another, very independent, end up coming with the same conclusions from possibly very different sets of data. And that's what Darwin and Wallace did. So Darwin's ideas, which he was very, you know, kind of hesitant to talk about because he knew that, you know, people would get very upset with him. He knew that it was going to affect people's, you know, faith and all that. But as he was talking to Wallace, he realized, oh, they were coming up with the same idea. He better go ahead and publish before he gets scooped. And so he was able to publish before Wallace, but credited him too. And they wrote many letters to one another so we could see who kind of formulated which ideas. But they were coming up with a lot of the same things. And they were not even really, they weren't in the same place. They were looking at totally different things. And yet they were coming up with the same mechanisms to explain how species change over time. And that's basically natural selection. So a little bit about Darwin first. He was trained as a geologist. We've obviously, since he kind of began what we think about as natural biology, especially organismal and ecological biology, we would have to consider him a biologist. And his famous book is The Origin of Species, though he had written many, many others too. But this is the big one, so get a copy of that. It's a good one. So that's a little bit about Darwin. Where he was studying was largely the Galapagos. It's kind of what he's most famous for studying. So the Galapagos Islands are here. They're off of Ecuador. So kind of circle that off of the west coast of South America. He was looking at finches. There are these birds in the Galapagos that we'll talk about a little bit later. Marine iguanas, which he said were just horrible, ugly beasts, but what marine iguanas are doing, and I don't think he realized this at the time, but they're kind of in an evolutionary transition where they're going from terrestrial to more and more marine. So they're pretty much fully terrestrial, or their ancestors have been. They're just evolved from some kind of iguana that somehow made it over to the Galapagos, probably on a raft of vegetation during a storm. That happens a lot in islands, it turns out. So reptiles can make it from one island to the next pretty easily, or maybe even just swimming. They get lost out at sea and end up on an island. But anyway, so there's iguanas very similar to this on Ecuador and the rest of South America. There are tortoises very similar to those on the Galapagos on the rest of South America. But he also realized that each of the Galapagos tortoises seemed to be very specially adapted for the specific island that they were at. That was very special. And the iguanas are becoming more and more aquatic. Iguanas are plant eaters. So these guys are eating plants, not a lot of plant life to eat on these dry, harsh, hot rocks of the Galapagos Islands. They are swimming instead and having to swim pretty deep down, tens and tens of feet down into the water to get algae from rocks. So they still have their vegetarian diet, but they're having to go about it in a very, very different way than any of their ancestors. So Darwin thought that was kind of fascinating. Of course, he couldn't have ever seen them quite like this, no scuba diving back then. Here's the tortoises. Sorry, I know this is a little blurry. But we have a few different species of tortoise that to Darwin seemed in a lot of ways very similar to what he was seeing on the mainland. But they all seemed very specifically adapted, almost perfectly designed, it seemed, very specifically adapted for their environments. So he was seeing that some of them have like a big saddle-shaped shell where the shell kind of scoops back away far, allowing these turtles to reach up really high and reach the type of vegetation that exists on that specific island. Whereas other islands don't really have that kind of vegetation, and different shapes of shells seem to work. But they all seem very similar to the ones in Ecuador and other parts of the mainland. Now, of course, what we could do is we can study these tortoises, the finches, the marine iguanas, all these things in the Galapagos, and they're being very, very well studied. We know quite a bit about them, and are able to tell how long ago they evolved from their ancestors that were from the mainland. We can even track down exactly on the mainland where their ancestors came from and what species they derived from. So the cool thing about, I think this is just a great example of how science works and how big scientific ideas work, is that we are looking at something, Darwin's coming up with these ideas of natural selection and, very tentative stuff. He's extremely conservative in his ideas. He's very modest. He doesn't just put it out there. He's very like, oh gosh, I don't know. I want to be absolutely sure before I write any of this down and let people know about it. But now we're looking at this 200 years later, or 150 years later, and now we do things like genetics. We have a whole new field of biological science to get into and see if Darwin was right or not. There were some things he had some issues with, but hey, he was right about a whole lot of things. And everything that's going on in the Galapagos, he had a really, really good insight for someone who was studying this stuff in the 1830s. It's incredible what he was able to accomplish with so little. But he had Lyell's Principles of Geology book to back him up, so he had a lot of time to deal with. He knew all these little changes that could take place over a long period of time could add up to something big, like the difference between a saddleback shell and a dome-shaped shell. So he felt like he had a lot of time to play with if the Earth was much older than people thought. So anyway, so that's a little bit more of this. Wallace, I'm starting to learn more about Wallace as I go because, like most people, I've learned a lot about Darwin, not quite so much about Wallace. But he was studying some different places. He was looking at mostly Indonesia. So his studies took him to a very different part of the world, and he was looking at very different animals. But again, we're looking at island life, and animals can evolve, and plants can evolve very, very rapidly on islands because islands necessarily cause one population to be isolated from others. So island biogeography, very fascinating field in ecology because we could see the stuff happening quite quickly. So his book is called The Malay Archipelago, and he's written a few books, but that's a big one. And it's kind of an adventure story. It's all about his travels specifically. So he was looking at, well, he's one of the first Europeans to see and really begin to study birds of paradise. And these are on New Guinea. And some other birds of paradise live in other parts of Indonesia and these other islands off the coast of Australia, between Australia and Asia. So he's looking at birds of paradise and beginning to develop ideas on, okay, well, these crazy feathers here, like these white, plumes hanging off of these, I think just the males, lots of sexual dimorphism in birds of paradise. We'll talk about sexual dimorphism and sexual selection in a little bit, but he was seeing that, okay, we're looking at, some features here that are not very helpful. How could that help? In fact, it might hinder their lives. It might allow them to be more easily noticed by predators, might allow these animals to be, they might get stuck in the trees and might catch on things. And it's just, this doesn't seem very practical. What's the point of something like this? Darwin, I believe, was the one who proposed something called female choice, the idea that females choose the male that's the best looking, the most attractive to her. All that, and he was ridiculed for it because, hey, Victorian times, women certainly are not having much of a opinion on things, right? But he kind of, maybe it's because he was in a very, very good marriage, I don't know, but he was actually beginning to understand that females play a huge role in the direction that evolution can take. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but there's not a lot of better examples of that than birds of paradise because, here's the female. She's brown, she's very drab, and it's because she's the one that sits on the nest, right? You don't want to be all pretty and colorful if you're the one sitting on the nest and protecting the babies and trying to keep the babies safe. You want to be camouflaged. The male, of course, is not so lucky. It is lucky to look like this. It is lucky to be drab. You live longer. You're not going to be picked off by a predator as easily. The males, though, they're selected to be very pretty and very showy and very attractive. They are not really giving the female anything useful in the form of these feathers. New Guinea and other places like this are places where the females have tons of food. He doesn't have to provide her with food. He doesn't have to provide her with a nest site like many birds in the world do. He just has to be good looking, and that works. That works in a lot of rainforest environments and leads to some really crazy features like big peacock tails and things like that, things that can actually inhibit the male from being able to fly very well. But if it's attractive to the female and she likes it enough, and it means that he's going to pass on more of his genetic material through mating with more females, then it's selected for. Whether it's useful or not, just being able to pass it on, that's useful enough in evolution. Because that's basically what we're looking at, is passing on something in evolutionary, progress. So he shows off to the female. She's extremely picky. We really don't understand what exactly they're looking for, but they know, I guess. And she will mate with the one who. And it's not like she's thinking about this. She's not like, oh yeah, I want those genes to go to my babies. She doesn't know that. It's just that she's drawn to what she's drawn to, and just that changes the whole population. So female choice, really big really cool thing. I also have a video for you to check out about that where they'll explain it much, much better than I did. But natural selection, I think, is pretty fascinating. And it's something that Darwin thought of that people thought he was really ridiculous for that, more ridiculous for that than for anything else he was saying. Surely women can't play a role in this very important process that you're talking about. Well, they do, obviously, and in some cases much more than others. Wallace was also looking at beetles, though. He was collecting beetles and butterflies, so he was really focused on a lot of insects and was finding just huge variety in a lot of these insects in Indonesia and other parts of the Malay archipelago. So they were looking at different animals. They were looking at different parts of the world. And yet, Wallace and Darwin both came up with very similar explanations on how life changes and how organisms change over time. One thing I had learned about this a long time ago, and then as I was pulling this material up, I was kind of reacquainted with it, something called Wallace's line. This was a big idea because remember, this is, Victorian times. We're coming up with this in like 1840s, 50s, 60s, something like that. And what Wallace was seeing here in these islands is that there's a big difference between, if we look at the Borneo, the Philippines, Sumatra, Java, those animals have a lot more in common with what we see in Asia. So we get a lot more monkeys there. So we get a lot more other Asian life, and not just mammals, but other things too. Though if we go over to New Guinea, we're starting to look at things that are more Australian. And that kind of makes sense because we're like, oh, okay, well, Asia is here, Australia is here, right? But it's kind of unusual to have, these islands are really close to another. Borneo and whatever this is, I don't know which one. Oh, Ternate is this one. It's probably not how you can say it, but either way, they're really close to each other, and yet they have very, very different wildlife. They're derived from the mainland. So in both cases, Wallace and Darwin are realizing that the nearby mainland is playing a big role. These organisms, because they're also looking at plants too, came from the mainland somehow, swimming, floating on a raft. If you're a plant, seeds floating across the sea. They made it to these islands and began to become isolated from other islands, even islands very close to them, and go through their own evolutionary processes. So in both situations, we're looking at that kind of thing, but Wallace was kind of lucky that instead of just looking at Ecuador and the Galapagos, he had two to look at the same time. He was realizing that even in these islands that are very close to one another, the wildlife is very, very different and derived from different mainlands. So that's pretty cool. This is Wallace's line from 1863. This has been altered a little bit, and it does get a little fuzzier than this. There's definitely some overlap in some places, but it was pretty cool, and it actually began to help people think about how biogeography, how where different life forms exist on Earth are going to have to do with, okay, well, what did sea level do? Well, a lot of this goes back to a time when sea level was far, far lower, and some of these islands were connected for a time. They're not connected now because sea level has been higher over the last tens of thousands of years, but for a time they were much more connected. So people began to think about that even during a time when they didn't understand or didn't know anything about ice ages and past glacial episodes. And they were also thinking about not quite yet. It's going to be a good 50 years before that's formally proposed, and another 50 at least before it's accepted by science. But early ideas of continental drift. Could these islands have moved away? I don't know if anyone's really quite on that yet, but the diversification of animal life all over the world starts to inform early major geological concepts that wouldn't really become a thing for a while yet. Okay, so this is kind of the nuts and bolts. I know you can't really read this, but you'll have access to the whole PowerPoint here. This is basically the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is Darwin's big concept, is the idea of natural selection. Everyone knew that organisms changed over time. Do they do it by stretching their neck? So every baby, like if you're a giraffe, so every baby that's born has a little bit longer neck because you spent your time stretching your neck. That's Lamarckism. not the case. You know, it has to have a genetic base, it turns out, to be passed on. Darwin didn't know anything about genes, obviously, but he was able to come up with a mechanism to explain how evolution can occur that it turns out was based on something that we know today happens because we can understand genetics today. He didn't, but yeah, the idea is, so we're looking at a reindeer picture here. We're looking at a whole different population, or a whole population of light-colored animals, dark-colored animals. Darwin was very heavily influenced by a guy named Thomas Malthus, who was an economist. And he was writing about, back when people were beginning to really think about things like this, like economics and, just, government and stuff like that. He was beginning to think of, well, not everybody can be rich. There's going to have to be poor people because there aren't enough resources for everybody. And some people just aren't going to make it. They're not going to get all the resources that other people are going to get for whatever reason. And so Darwin was reading those books too by Malthus. It's not even really, what we think of as science. It's, different a little bit. And it heavily influenced him because he realized, hey, the same thing happens in nature. Not everybody in nature, not all the life out in the world is going to survive, not long enough to reproduce anyway. Nature is a hard place to live, and Darwin was one of the first to begin to think that, we kind of have this Garden of Eden idea about nature, and we still do. When people say things like, oh, that animal shouldn't be in a zoo, it should be out in the wild. Well, what wild? What? In Sumatra, where there's no forest for Sumatran rhinos to live? Really? What wild are you talking about? So we still kind of have a concept of the wild as being this Garden of Eden type of place, where everything just is in a balance and stuff like that. And it's never been that way, and certainly isn't now, but it's never been that way. And Darwin realized nature is a hard place to live in. Babies die all the time. The likelihood of any animal living to its first year of life is pretty slim, much less living long enough to reproduce. So Darwin realized that, and if anything, maybe like in this picture here, a slightly different color of coat that might make you, what's happening in here? The lighter colored ones are dying off in this apparently cold, snowy climate. Well, maybe what's going on here, and doesn't say in this little picture, but maybe what's going on is the warmer, the darker coat absorbs more solar energy, allowing the darker colored animals to retain their body heat more. So if they just have this slight edge over the lighter colored ones, then they may last longer, live longer, reproduce more, have more babies, pass on that dark-coated gene to more offspring than the light-coated deer are able to do. So over time, because we have this variation and we have nature being a harsh place to live, selecting on that variation, we are changing the population overall. So now over here, number 4, adaptation, the animals that had the dark, well, there's more of them now because that genetic diversity has spread in the population, and now we have more dark colored reindeer than we have light colored because it was more successful. And one thing I want to point out is that when people think about evolution, they tend to think about it as having a goal, and it doesn't. It's not a thinking thing. It's dealing with the situation as it is. What if, looking at just this picture here, so we have these darker colored deer that are more successful now in this snowy, cold environment. But what if there's a predator here? Because I guess these guys would have evolved this way in a maybe without a predator around. But what if you have a predator that then is able to see the darker colored ones against the snow, and the lighter colored ones are more camouflaged? Well, then it could switch. It could definitely switch, where then you get more dark colored ones dying off and the light colored ones surviving long enough to pass on their genes. That sort of thing happens all the time. And what you're thinking, looking at this too, is okay, well, we're not necessarily getting new species. No. speciation is something that occurs from this happening over a long period of time. Usually, though, we can see it happening in bacteria, insects. We definitely see it happening in birds. There's definitely organisms we can actually see speciation occurring. But when we're looking at something with long generation times, like a deer, it's not going to happen very, very quickly. And the selection can be very powerful for a short period of time. But if, like I mentioned, a predator shows up and then it goes back the other way, well, you're not going to have time to get a new species before that shows up. So, but that's essentially what it's all about, is looking at natural selection, thinking about how the genes are being passed on. Kind of a classic example that's been pretty well studied, and this is something else that creationists have written about, but that it's actually a pretty well understood thing. And this shows up in so many different textbooks, and again, is not like one of our proofs of evolution, because we know what happens. It's just this is kind of a clean example, and back during Victorian England was a way to get people to think, oh, okay, now I kind of understand what's going on. But this is the pepper moths. This is kind of a good example of that switching taking place, where the lighter colored pepper moths were far more common than the dark ones until the Industrial Revolution. So now we have soot and very dark colors on our buildings, and now the dark colored ones are more camouflaged, aren't able to be picked off so easily by birds. So we end up getting a population then of more darker colored ones because they pass on those genes, just like the deer we were just talking about. After things kind of got cleaned up a bit, people started to try to burn cleaner materials and get a little smarter about that. The lighter colored pepper moths came back. So we kind of have that switch going on, which is pretty cool. And these are not necessarily different species because they didn't experience enough reproductive isolation from one another, and probably also didn't have enough time. But it's insects, so it doesn't often take that much time. But it's a good example of how it can kind of occur. So the reason why Darwin was coming up with these ideas, and Wallace too, but Darwin was realizing from principles of geology that, there's a lot of time here. I can actually talk about, this could actually happen in the amount of time that geologists like Charles Lyell, James Hutton, all these guys think the age of the Earth is. Now I've got tons of time. These things can occur and actually create new species over a long period of time. So just understand species are more plastic than people thought, more changeable than people thought, is a huge contribution of his. And a lot of people have a hard time thinking that a species is a species. A tiger is a tiger, a lion is a lion. There's so much more intermediate stuff than we often think about. Okay, so some key points of natural selection is this is not happening to individuals. These specific moths or deer are not changing. An individual cannot evolve. This isn't Pokemon. They don't evolve. What happens is populations change. So I could do all the push-ups I want in the whole, as long as I want, and my shoulder muscles might get really, really big, but if I have a baby, it's not going to come out with big shoulder muscles. That's kind of something that Lamarck was thinking would happen. And Darwin realized, no, that doesn't happen. The whole population changes, but individuals don't necessarily change. One of Darwin's big influences was something called artificial selection, the idea that we can create new breeds, I guess. I don't know if I'd call them species so much. A bulldog is not a different species from a Great Dane or a Chihuahua. They're different breeds. But Darwin realized that over a long period of time, what we do as we create, there's a really good video that I'll have for you guys too. I think it's another Stated Clearly video, where basically all the kale, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, mustard greens, I think, all these different plants, they're all from one single plant. and like some kind of weed that grew in England along coastal areas or something. And then we've taken that and changed it and have created so many very different vegetables that you may not even use in the same dish. We think about them as very different. They're all the same. They're all derived not that long ago from one specific thing. That's kind of cool. Same thing with dogs. We can go back to when we first started to domesticate dogs, from the North American gray wolf. We've created Great Danes, we've created Chihuahuas, bulldogs. Got my little mix here. Just bizarre things. And, they can all interbreed, so they're not different species necessarily, though that's not a good definition of a species either. But anyway, over a long period of time, this probably can create new species. And that's what Darwin was thinking of. So he was very influenced by artificial selection, especially pigeon breeders in England. All sorts of pigeons with fluffy feet, colorful feathers on their head, all sorts of things. And he realized that realized that the breeder is basically acting like nature in real life by deciding who breeds and who doesn't breed. That's kind of what nature does, decides, okay, who is successful enough to be able to pass on their genetic material and who is, you can't really survive this winter. You can't, whatever, not on purpose, but that's what ends up happening. And this is another common misconception too. Evolution does not require that simple things become more complex. Lots of things become more simple over time. In some ways you would consider a garter snake to be more simple than a lizard because it doesn't have as many limbs. It doesn't have any limbs as a lizard. And that doesn't mean that snakes are more simple than lizards, because rattlesnakes have something totally different going on up here, and venom sacs and all that sort of thing that lizards really don't have. So you can't really talk about that going on. We can talk about a more simple organ system, kind of like what I just did with the snake. Like our nose, for instance, our human nose is super, super simple compared to the nose of a bear or a star-nosed mole, really complex noses, or a whole bunch of animals. We have a pretty crappy sense of smell. But our brains are pretty complex, much more complex than like the brain of a starfish or something like that. So individual organ systems can become more or less complex. But to talk about a whole organism being more complex than something else, a human isn't really more complex than a dog necessarily. It just doesn't really make sense. So evolution also does not have that goal or any goal in mind. Things don't really go towards being more complex. Sometimes being more simple is better. Definitely, being a more simple animal can be a benefit in a lot of ways. And vestigial organs, good example here. So and you see this a lot in mounted, like whale mounts, like in museums and stuff, where they'll also hang the vestigial, like little hip and little femur, and even have a bit of that knee joint there. If we go back in the fossils, we see more intermediate forms with a whole ankle and everything, but modern day whales usually just have this little bit. Good example of vestigial organ. Is it a problem for this bone to be here? It's not doing anything, but it's also not hurting anything either. And another kind of rule about evolution is if it ain't broke, don't fix it, So this whale is having to maybe, work a little harder to create some more bone, maybe use a little bit more calcium or something to make this bone, but it's not really hurting anything. There's not a lot of selective pressure to eliminate that structure. So it sticks around and it's fine, but it gives us a record of what the history was. So once natural selection, I hate that that's covering that picture, but again, you guys will have access to this full time. Sorry, I was trying to see if I can move that. So there's a lot of cool things going on. When I taught a comparative vertebrate anatomy class at Montana State University, we're basically teaching this class to pre-vet students, which was pretty cool. And I didn't really get to work with human cadavers. I was more interested in the shark and the cat and animals like, just cutting up other animals. And one of the cool things that we realized, and we were teaching this, is that the gill arches in a shark or any fish, sharks are often dissected, these gill arches are the same that we see in a human embryo. And then they actually create different things in a human skull, like different nerves, They contribute to different musculature, different bones. So our hyoid bone, even our clavicles here kind of represent some of the last ones. Mammal inner ear bones are derived from some of these jaw bones too. So many things that are about being a mammal or being a human are actually derived from what we see in our fishy ancestors. That's pretty cool. If you're interested in that, if you're more interested in that, there's a whole series by Neil Shubin, one of the discoverers of Tiktaalik, very cool intermediate tetrapod form or fishapod, called Your Inner Fish, all about these sort of anatomical features. But yeah, and again, this isn't something that are based on crappy drawings from the 1830s. This is a big part of how we understand human birth defects today, and how what a human fetus should look like at different stages during its development. And yeah, gill arches are there, and they're fine, and they change. You know, some gill arches go and become some of the inner ear bones. Some gill arches go and become some of the jaw here. You know, they also contribute to the nerves, which, by the way, some of these nerves take quite a big way around, but it's because they are based on our ancestry. Just like the whale, or what was it I was mentioning before? Oh yeah, just like the whale's flipper, where that hand shape may not be perfect, but hey, it works. We are also we were also limited by what our ancestors' anatomy was. That's pretty cool. Okay, so a lot of the things we were talking about before, you know, like the fossils change over time. Life can be organized by a nested hierarchy, the Linnaean system, because, you know, life is a tree branching out from common ancestors. When we come up with a big idea in science, it has to explain a lot of things. Not just a lot of things. It has to explain pretty much everything. Plate tectonics, that we'll get into later on, was a really good example of this. All of a sudden, with understanding plate tectonics, now we can explain why mountains form where they do, and why volcanoes form where they do, and why different kinds of volcanoes exist where they do, and why earthquakes occur where they do, and all this sort of stuff. Evolution, same thing, even though it was way earlier than plate tectonics, but that's okay, we'll deal with that later. Evolution has that responsibility. Any scientific theory, and again, theory doesn't mean, oh, I've got this idea of something that happens. A theory in science is used very much like music theory. You know, when you study music theory, that means that you're studying different pitches, different notes, how they work together, how chords work. You know, like, oh, this is a seventh chord or whatever. Now I haven't played in a band for a little bit, so now I'm already like forgetting things. But that's, you know, music theory doesn't mean that, oh, we're wondering if music is a thing or not. No, that's not what music theory means. It means the study of this thing, where we want to get into more detail. We want to learn more about it, because we don't know everything about music theory. There's research going on in it, usually dealing with physics and sound and all that. But it's a hot field of research, just like evolution, where we're discovering new things all the time. And yeah, some of those guys back in the 1850s, they didn't have it all right, and that's okay, because hopefully, you know, we're changing a lot of things from what we thought in the 1850s. That's okay. But the reason why evolution is our basic field or kind of our basic theory in biology is because it has stood the test of time pretty brilliantly, and it explains a lot of things. So a lot of these mysteries that people were thinking of, like, well, why do fossils change over time? And, you know, it's weird that we can kind of group organisms together in kind of nested hierarchy and, you know, things like that. It's all because of evolution. So once evolution by natural selection was understood, you know, these flashy features that that the birds of paradise had, all these mysteries about wildlife were able to be solved, or at least partly explained. Of course, you always end up with more questions than answers, but hey, they were at least partly able to be explained by this idea of natural selection. And that's basically why it was a pretty powerful theory, and why it still is a powerful theory, because it was able to answer so many mysteries. And it has that responsibility. A theory has, you can't have any contrary evidence. If anything shows up that disproves anything about evolution, then the idea is in trouble, you know? So theories have a huge responsibility, But yeah, this is a very powerful one. So when we say something's a theory, it means it's a very powerful idea. A law, that's totally something else, and we don't really deal with laws anymore. Those are kind of old-timey ideas. All right, what are we talking about here? Okay, finches, yeah. Sorry, my picture's kind of showing kind of in front of something. But so Darwin was looking at these finches at the Galapagos, and finches are a very cool thing to study, the Galapagos finches particularly, I mean, because we can catch them in mist nets. We could get genetic tests from them. There's a book about this called The Beak of the Finch you could read about, and how they've been studying Galapagos finches throughout the 70s and 80s and really finding out a lot of cool stuff about them. So that's a very neat book. And they're finding they can actually track when these different species, because these are different species, when these different species diverged from one another and became isolated, reproductively isolated on their own island, and even when the first couple finches came over from the mainland. So the thing that was going on here is that Darwin was collecting all these birds. He was collecting all sorts of samples of animals and plants, just like Wallace. That's what people did back then. They would just collect, collect, collect. We don't do it quite so much now, but yeah, that's what they were doing. So he was collecting all these birds, and he was like, oh, this one's a mockingbird. This one's a sparrow. This one's a parrot. This one's a finch. This one's a warbler or something. I don't know. He was thinking they were all these different things, but once he sent them back to London, and anatomists and people who really understood bird anatomy were looking at them, they were like, oh, no, these are all the same kind of finch. The only differences between them are like their color, the shape and size of their beak, and their overall shape and size. But anatomically, they're all kind of the same sort of thing. So we know now that only a couple individuals, I don't know if they have an idea of how many exactly, but only a few individuals of only a species or so came over from the mainland, became reproductively isolated on these different islands, and adapted to the different foods on those islands. So some of them were, getting big seeds from the ground. So they got these really big, thick beaks, kind of like cardinals do today. Others were eating like fruits and flowers, so kind of a longer beak to be able to kind of work its way in there. Insect eaters, all sorts of different beak shapes, because, and again, it's very fortunate Darwin went to the Galapagos to see this, but bird beaks are particularly plastic, meaning that they change very rapidly. One of the big benefits to not even having teeth, if you're a bird, is that that beak is under a lot of pressure and can actually change really rapidly in only, not even that many generations. So he was looking at organisms that had evolved very rapidly, like the Galapagos finches. So now we know they're all related to one another, but we can understand a bit about how they've changed. Okay. So the basic pattern of the history of living things is kind of a tree of life, like Darwin was drawing, where we can go back to the common ancestor of these. So the last common ancestor here of like this branch, and that's kind of weird. Oh, I guess that's a highlighter. Okay. Oh, all right. Anyway, so we could see the last common ancestor of these guys and how they've changed over time. And we could also draw it like branches like this, where the tips of the branches are animals that are still around today. So these guys went extinct, this one went extinct. So we're looking at time as we go through as well. And so this is where geological time, or deep time, becomes very important, because if we're thinking, like people had done for a long time, that the Earth is very, very young, it becomes really, really hard to be able to process all the changes and all the things that have to take place in order to get these organisms to become different species, to become significantly different from one another. But this is where deep time comes in and helps us out. If we got a lot of time, yeah, these things can happen. Even with, things like reindeer and humans and whales, not just birds and bacteria and bugs. Okay, so a couple of different patterns of evolution I want to get into. Talk about this one briefly, because we've already talked about it a bit, but sexual selection, again, one that Darwin was kind of coming up with, because he saw that females and males looked very different and he wondered why. Some of these will be, I know you can't really see it, but there's just a buck here with a nice set of antlers kind of chasing this deer. It's very obvious. If you have antlers and you're a deer, you are fighting off rival males, right? You're trying to protect your lady. You're trying to protect your territory, something like that. And people kind of understood that, and the female must go to the male because he's protecting her and taking care of her. He's a knight in shining armor and all that sort of thing. Maybe, but what's probably happening is that the female is, realizing that she likes those antlers, and he's going to get more matings, and she's going to be able to pass on those genes to her babies. So her babies may have nice big antlers too, might be big and strong, that sort of thing. That one's a little more clear. What is hard to make sense of is this guy over here, very classic example of kind of sexual selection gone wild. This is an African widow bird. And kind of like with the birds of paradise in New Guinea we were talking about before, this is an animal whose tail is so long that it has difficulty flying. There was a study done many years ago where what the researchers did was they took African widow birds and they cut some of their tails off. Doesn't matter, their feathers will grow in the next season, don't worry about it. But they cut some of their tails off so they're really short, and then they took some of those tails and stuck them onto the tail, the existing tail of other African widow birds. And you could probably imagine what happened. The African widow birds with a double long tail couldn't even fly. They couldn't even get off the ground, but they were mobbed by the females. So the girls were really wanting that tail, even though it was completely useless and it even hurt the animal. He couldn't even in the wild. He wouldn't have been able to survive. This was a lab experiment, but he was getting all the ladies, and the male with the little short stubby tail, none, even though he was, flying around and doing just fine. That's kind of crazy. So what's going on? What's going on in those females to get them to go after this? It's because their genes tell them to go after a longer tail because their mom went after a longer tail and their mom went and back as far as we go. So that's kind of how sexual selection can kind of go. Obviously, though, in nature, not this lab experiment, but in nature, there's a balance between what the females are preferring and what is going to keep you alive, because an African widow bird with a double long tail wouldn't be able to survive in nature. So it's not just sexual selection here. There's also predator selection. Is the predator picking you off before you're able to mate with all the dozen of females that want to mate with you? That's not going to work either, right? So there's a balance, and that's a very tight balancing act that birds like this walk every day. Might be wondering, okay, why is it female choice, not male choice? It's because females are the limiting factor when it comes to having babies. The female, just to create an egg, and I don't mean just a bird or reptile egg, but like the biological egg is still much bigger than sperm. One female, think of a human, can probably only have one baby every year or so, but a male human can theoretically have hundreds, right? Because how many sperm, or we don't have to talk about that, but usually, and sometimes it is the other way around, there are some birds where the female is the more colorful, attractive one, and the male selects the female, but that's because the male is the one that takes care of the eggs. So when it comes to child rearing and creating that baby in the first place, biologically, what does it take to create that baby? Females are almost always the limiting factor, so they are more selective when it comes to who they mate with. There's nothing about ethics here or morals or anything like that. It's all about biology. And anyway, that's pretty cool. And that's something Darwin was thinking of that people thought he was nuts, but he was right. Okay, another pattern that we see a lot, especially in the fossil record, is adaptive radiation. This means that basically an organism has evolved a game-changing bit of anatomy or something like that. A good example that this picture is dealing with is the amniotic egg. So the first reptiles are kind of defined, how are they different from the amphibians of the Permian period and the Carboniferous period? Well, there's a fine line, not a whole lot difference there is going on. But one thing they did do is develop something called the amniotic egg, which basically means a pond within a shell. these animals are able to lay eggs on land for the first time. You know, modern day amphibians, frogs, salamanders, toads, have to still lay their eggs in a nice little pond somewhere. Well, the reptiles are going to get away from the water altogether, and they're able to finally, for the first time, lay their eggs on dry land because now they have a shell that breathes. It allows moisture and gases to go through, waste to get out of the shell, but it also protects the baby and keeps it nice and wet on the inside, which is what a developing baby needs. It can't dry out. So once that amniotic egg, that game-changing bit of anatomy evolved, reptiles exploded. So we have a huge explosion of reptiles here early in the Permian period. Once that amniotic egg showed up, we got a whole bunch of these guys. Are these actually reptiles? We could just call these amniotes. That's fine, because there is debate as to whether a lot of these guys are reptiles at all, especially as we talk about the mammalian lineage, which actually, this doesn't even show, okay, yeah, there's therapsids. Mammals will evolve from the therapsids. Were these reptiles? Were their ancestors reptiles? They were amniotes. That's fine. Anyway, but the amniotic egg was a game changer. It allowed reptiles and other amniotes to take over. And then they changed in so many different forms. We have some that end up going back into the ocean, like some marine reptiles. We have some that become, you know, they start to live in trees and burrows. They become the things that would eventually become lizards and snakes. They develop some really cool anatomical features, especially in their hip and their lower leg and their face, able to maintain their body temperature better, have warm-blooded and higher metabolism, and they become the archosaurs, particularly our favorite, the dinosaurs. And then eventually we get birds evolving off of that too. So basically, aside from the amphibians like frogs, salamanders, and toads, all amniotes alive today, all tetrapods alive today, aside from those guys, are amniotes. We have the amniotic egg. Now, that doesn't mean that mammals have eggs, because very few mammals lay eggs, but we've derived the placenta and other things from that amniotic egg. So we still have remnants of that, including a little yolk sac in our placenta when mammals get pregnant. Anyway, that's not important here, but I just mean that when there's a very special kind of invention, I don't want to really call it that, but it's fine. When there's a very special, very helpful invention like this, we just have a huge explosion. The Cambrian explosion is not a bad example either. So that happens, and we especially see that in the fossil record, because it looks like, okay, not a whole lot going on, then all of a sudden this thing happened, and there's a whole bunch of different fossils, big diversification in a very short time. This is one of my favorites, Convergent Evolution. This is a really hard one to understand sometimes. This example I'm giving here looks pretty it looks pretty easy, but this is tricky. Convergent evolution is where we have organisms that are not necessarily related to one another whatsoever that develop the same solution to a problem. Before we talk about this example, because I think this one's a little trickier, I'll talk about a much simpler one. Wings. Think about all the animals that have wings. Dragonflies, butterflies. Okay, well, they're kind of related. They're insects, but birds, bats, pterosaurs. Yeah, those kind of cover some of the major groups. All those animals have wings. So you would not say that that these animals are necessarily related to one another because they have wings. Because birds and bats and pterosaurs, those are, none of them are insects, especially. So none of these are related to one another because of having wings. Wings are just a solution to a problem that many different organisms, many different animals have come up with at the same time, or not at the same time necessarily, but the same solution to a problem. They want to fly. They need to develop the ability to fly. Wings will do that. So lots of different animals develop wings that aren't necessarily related to one another. A little less obvious, a little harder to understand, but is really, really cool, is what's going on between the placental mammals and marsupials. So it would be very easy to see this little marsupial mouse. And just because of the way it looks, it would, okay, well, it's like a mouse, right? It's like a little rodent type of guy, right? Because mice are rodents. But it's not. It's a marsupial, and marsupials are from a specific lineage of the mammal group, the mammal class, and they're not related that closely to placentals. So this mouse, no matter how mousy it looks, is actually more closely related to other marsupials like koalas and kangaroos and everything else on this list than it is to a placental rodent mouse. Same thing with the lemur, wolf. I know we don't have a picture of the Tasmanian wolf here, sorry. The same kind of thing. So we can call that a Tasmanian wolf or a marsupial mole, but they're really not. All these marsupials are more closely related to one another, no matter how different their anatomies are, than they are to any of their convergent evolution counterparts. It's just that in Australia, there's a niche for a burrower. We need to have something burrowing. Okay. We need to have something that eats ants. All right. We need to have something little that eats seeds. We need to have something climbing up in the trees. We need to have something flying around from the trees. We need to have a large predator and another large predator. And marsupials take on those challenges and come up with very similar body plans as the placentals do, but they're not necessarily related to one another. This happens a lot when I teach classes with dinosaurs, especially, where we see a lot of things like that, a lot of examples of convergent evolution. Again, don't necessarily indicate relatedness. Coevolution is a cool one that we're becoming more and more interested in as we're dealing with the extinctions of different plants and animals today. So today we're in the 6th extinction, and that's helping us to understand that organisms are reliant on one another for survival in a lot of cases. A really cool example here are Hawaiian honey creepers. I'm not sure if that's what this picture is, but something in a tropical part of the world. I know Puerto Rico, Costa Rica have lots and lots of flowering plants that are really only able to be pollinated by one species of bird or insect. Because they're evolving so closely to one another, so much in concert with one another, that this beak shape is perfectly adapted to going right down the throat of that flower. And maybe no other bird is quite able to pollinate this species of flower as can others. Why is this a big deal? Well, because when a flower, and the whole reason why plants have flowers in the first place is to basically convince animals to help them have sex. That's what flowers are. The flower, it's not really beneficial to the flower if this bird goes and messes with this flower, gets a little sip of nectar, gets some pollen on its head, and then goes off to a totally different species of flower, because then that pollen is wasted and isn't going to the right place. That pollen needs to go to the same species. So it's beneficial for the flower to be so specific in shape that it's only able to exist with one type of bird or butterfly. Only one species is able to pollinate it. That way, when this bird goes and gets its nectar treat and gets some pollen on its head, it's going to go right to another individual of the same species of flower. That's pretty cool. That's pretty beneficial for that flower. It's guaranteeing that its genetic material isn't being wasted. Obviously, there's a drawback, and when we deal with extinction events, this is the drawback, is that when one goes extinct, the other one is at big risk of going extinct. The story of avocados are kind of like this. Avocados are obviously a little domesticated now, we eat them, but they evolved along with the giant ground sloth. And the giant ground sloth, and a lot of fruit did, a lot of fruiting plants evolved with large migratory mammals that would eat them, including the seed, because seeds are really hard to break. Not many mammals can, but they'd swallow the seed whole and then go poop it out somewhere in a nice pile of manure, a nice pile of compost, perfect for that little seed, to go ahead and start growing into a tree. The coevolution between plants and animals is fascinating. So, when the giant ground sloth went extinct, the avocado also could have gone extinct, except people realized that avocados are pretty awesome. So we didn't let that happen. And now, they're kind of dependent on us. But yeah, they grow and to feed an animal that no longer exists. which is kind of sad, but you know, that's what happens. So if this little bird, if this, I think this is a honey creeper, if this bird goes extinct, this flower has a very good chance of going extinct as well. That's one example of coevolution. Coevolution can also be something like an arms race. A good example is this cheetah here chasing this, what was that, probably Thompson's gazelle, I think. They're both very fast, super fast. It's more beneficial if the Thompson's gazelle can live longer, reproduce more, pass on more of its genetic material, you know, to its offspring, if it's able to be very fast, because it can outrun cheetahs or be very alert. There's a lot of other things going on here. Obviously, the cheetah is a life or death situation for both of them. The cheetah is going to be able to better pass on its genetic material if it's able to eat enough to survive to, you know, have a bunch of sex too. So it's beneficial for them both to be fast. So they're both being selected for speed, to the extent that we start to get long, skinny legs that are probably at risk of being broken. We get very flexible backs that are probably at risk of being damaged, but the most important thing is that they're able to outrun one another. So this would be an arms race where they're kind of both going in the same evolutionary path in competition. Not really competition, but in I don't want to act like there's some kind of war going on here, but in you know, in their interaction with one another, it's beneficial for them both to be very fast, so they keep getting faster and faster. Anyway, so it can be kind of a coevolution, almost a symbiotic relationship like this, or what we would call an evolutionary arms race like this. So coevolution, a couple different things. This is one that's a kind of a difficult one to talk about because you do hear this a lot. Even, you know, paleontologists use this term sometimes. We don't like it though. Living fossils, that doesn't even make sense. A fossil is not necessarily something that's dead and gone. It's just something that it's the remnant of something. So this doesn't even make sense. But so that's why I put it in quotes. It's not a term that we really like a lot. But one of the things that people often do is when they're talking about an organism that hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot in a very long period of time, they talk about how it's evidence against evolution. Well, the fact that these sort of things are pretty rare really means that they're kind of exceptions to the rule of evolution. But not really. This doesn't mean that they don't experience pressure. They don't experience evolutionary pressure. It just means that they've been pretty successful, and you know, they haven't had to change a whole lot. So a good example here is the coelacanth. You also hear people talk about like horseshoe crabs are a good example. Sharks, those sharks today are way different than they were back when they, you know, were first around, you know, 200, 300, 450 million years ago. You know, sharks today are not like the first ones, which were kind of lame and dumb and stuff. Little, you know, we're not talking about megalodon or anything like that. But, you know, so things still change. And it's kind of a silly thing to say, because when we're talking about, we can go back, the first mammals are about the same age as the first dinosaurs, right? So when people are like, oh, well, this thing has been around since the age of the dinosaurs, well, it's most things. Anyway, so that's kind of a difficulty. But yeah, the coelacanth is a fish that was thought to be extinct for a long time. It was thought to have gone extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, along with the non-avian dinosaurs, but had actually been around a lot longer than that. But then a fisherman, I believe around Indonesia, pulled up a fish that he didn't recognize. He thought was weird. This is back in the early 1900s, no refrigeration really for this thing. So he ended up calling like a lab, and the head of the lab wasn't able to come, but he knew someone. This was a woman named Mary Latimer, who worked in the lab and understood fish anatomy very well, and he sent her to go. And she went, and by the time she got to the story of the coelacanth is really cool. I'm rusty on it, obviously, but you know, check it out. Once she got to the coelacanth, it had been dead for a couple days. It was gross. But she knew exactly what it was when she saw it, and just thought it was amazing. So this is called Coelacanth latimeria is the species name. I don't know who the namer was, but it was named after Mary Latimer. And yeah, pretty cool story. And we have this sort of thing happening every now and then. But again, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been evolutionary pressures. It just means, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? It's worked. This pattern has kind of worked. And almost every situation where someone does talk about a living fossil, oh, it's unchanged since the time of the dinosaurs or for 300 million years or whatever, and there's always been some changes that have taken place. Modern day coelacanths are not identical to ancient ones, but they're pretty shockingly close. Yeah, that's kind of special. But all right. So we can't have evolution without having extinction. And this was something that was kind of understood before Darwin's time. It was Georges Cuvier who kind of came up with the idea of natural extinction. People knew that we were capable of driving animals to extinction. You know, the dodo had recently gone extinct, stellar sea cow. We knew that we could eliminate species, and very rapidly, as it turns out. But the idea of natural extinction was blasphemous. How, why would God create a new species just to have it disappear? That really, really upset people to think that that was a possibility. Well, but before Darwin came around, people were beginning to realize, no, it obviously has happened, because we find fossils of mastodons and fossils of, I guess, some of the early dinosaur material was being found and kind of understood for what it was before Darwin really came around. People were understanding that, okay, there are organisms in the fossils, in the fossil record, that are not quite like what we have today. So natural extinction must be a thing. But this is also a pattern or process of evolution too, because extinction means that it doesn't mean, and I think people think this, especially when they see movies like Disney's Dinosaur and stuff like that, that everything just dies, that we have all these individuals that just die. So when we see an extinction event, we should see a whole layer of dead animals, like individuals die from, the asteroid, or, die from freezing to death or something like that. No, that's not what an extinction is. An extinction is where a lineage dies out, meaning that all you really have to do is just not have a bunch of babies. The extinction event, whether it's an asteroid or a glaciation or sea level drop that decimates coastal habitats and coral reef systems, whatever it is, it doesn't have to actually kill anything. It just has to prevent them from reproducing at a sustainable rate. And so it's a little less dramatic and a lot slower than what we often kind of have the perception of. But so extinctions have occurred all throughout Earth history. There's always some sort of rate of background extinction. With mammals, species may only exist for 2 to 3 million years. With reptiles, probably 5 to 7 million years, something like that. It just depends. Every species is going to go extinct. So are we. We know that. But what we're usually what our fascination is kind of captured by is something called a mass extinction. And this is when many, many lineages all at once seem to disappear from the fossil record. The term I'm using here is geologically sudden. That can mean a lot of things. So if we see something like Disney movie Dinosaur, like I guess this is a picture from, right? We have the asteroid impact, a whole bunch of things die right away from tsunami or wildfires or poisonous gases or something like that. But then individuals persist for and then they get to that one special place with the lake, I don't know, for maybe weeks or months after the event. But that's really fast. Mass extinctions usually take a few million years, 2 to 3 million years at least. Any mass extinction that takes place in less than 1 million years is extremely fast. So geologically sudden, we're still thinking about this on geologic timescales where, we're not just killing a bunch of stuff right away or preventing things from reproducing over the next few years. It's over tens of thousands of years, if not, a few million years. So we have 6, if we're considering we're in the 6th extinction today, which most ecologists think we are. We have 6 major extinctions, and but that doesn't mean those are the only times when life has gone extinct. another definition of a mass extinction is that it's happening not just to one group, not just to the trilobites, or not just to big land animals or to amphibians or something like that. It's happening to a whole bunch of different, not very closely related organisms. And it doesn't always immediately have I don't think it ever immediately has a understood cause, because how can you explain what kind of event would it take to destroy coral reefs and destroy marine reptiles and big dinosaurs and this one special weird group of little mammals and these very successful groups of plants, whatever. So we have all these different groups. They all go extinct at about the same time. What could explain that? And so it's a much more difficult thing, and it's always going to be much more complex than just an asteroid. It's never just an asteroid. It's always more stuff than that going on, and that's pretty cool. So yeah, there's a lot about mass extinctions we don't understand, but we do understand some things. We know what the big ones were. Oh, good, you can actually see most of this picture. So here are the 5, so accepting the one that we're in today. And there's some really special ones here. The end Ordovician event. So this first one that we're looking at, this one took about 10 million years. And we lose about 85% of all marine species, which is kind of a big deal because everything was marine at that time. Nothing lived on land. So that's the only life we're talking about, really. And we're losing a whole lot, and it's largely due to a cooling event where sea level dropped, and that means that anything that lived in the shallow tropical seas, no glaciers, so everything was like kind of a warm sea, and pretty shallow, then they would have suffered, because as sea level drops, marine life then is high and dry, or at least experiencing very different conditions in the water than it was before. 10 million years, though. These, things couldn't adapt in 10 million years. It takes a long time for things to adapt, and it takes an even longer time for new species to evolve. So no, this resulted in extinction. The late Devonian is very famous for the big armored fish like Dunkleosteus and those other crazy big armored fish going extinct. The Devonian is known as the Age of Fish. Other marine life especially, had difficulty at the end of the Devonian, but yeah, the loss of all those armored fish was pretty surprising to people that were beginning to dig up these fish, and they seemed so cool and so dominating. They were the top predators. They were, almost every fish in the sea was one of these, and then they're just gone. There's a lot we don't understand about this one, but one of the things that we know is whenever there is a marine extinction event, anoxic conditions are often associated with it, so that loss of oxygen in the seas. Including today, we have an increase in anoxic conditions in the seas, and that's definitely a concern. The biggest one ever, and this one is actually estimated to be about 3 million years in length, though it could have been faster, is the one that killed off about 95% of all life on Earth, and that's the end Permian, also called the Great Dying. And this one's very special because it killed off a whole lot of things. It's the biggest extinction event ever. But again, it happened over a period of time, 3 million years, which, to put that in perspective, we're losing a whole lot of species in like a few hundred years, which is just a blink in time. So yeah, that's a few million years. That's a long time. But anyway, the cool thing about this extinction event is, notice it's before dinosaurs, because here's the dinosaur extinction. This actually helped to pave the way for the evolution of the dinosaurs in the first place, and the diversification of a whole bunch of different groups of reptiles, not just the dinosaurs. Then the end Triassic occurred, so there were a whole bunch of different kinds of reptiles, all living all over the world, very successful, taking over all sorts of niches, and then the end Triassic kind of ensured that only the dinosaurs, with their special anatomy and their ability to maintain their body temperature, would succeed. So then they go through and survive through the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, but then the big dinosaurs and a whole bunch of other groups of organisms go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. And then and that only killed off about half the life on Earth, still nothing compared to the Great Dying, but it was a big one because it's hard to imagine why something as successful and as awesome as dinosaurs would go extinct. But they did, and that is the fate of everything eventually. Okay, so anyway, there's just major extinctions, and this is kind of a cool image that shows a bit about the diversity and the loss of the diversity every time one of those extinction events happens. And again, remember, the big one is the end Permian here. So we're not getting into that much detail with the different extinctions, but do know that the one that killed off the dinosaurs is big, but it's nothing compared to the end Permian. This is a wild one, and it's my favorite one because it's the one that allowed the dinosaurs to really kind of take over this and that one, the end Triassic. And then, of course, we are in what's considered the 6th extinction today, and understanding patterns and processes of evolution and extinction, and how geology plays a role in extinction events throughout Earth history, whether it's global warming, global cooling, an asteroid, sea level fall, sea level rise, anoxic conditions in the sea, different poisonous gases being thrust up into the atmosphere by extensive volcanism, whatever it is. A new life form creating a brand new gas that's a poison to everything else that exists. That happened. Oxygen was a poison. These things happen, and throughout geologic time. But the cool thing is that by understanding the past, we can understand the present. We could say, hey, volcanism has caught a hold of some coal beds in the past, about 250 million years ago. Ooh, right about here. Burning a bunch of coal and putting carbon in the atmosphere at a very fast rate, much faster than plants could remove that carbon and so forth. So we have a runaway greenhouse effect where the climate just gets warmer and warmer and warmer and drier, because drought is often associated with hotter climates, and it's the drought that's probably more of a problem. But so we could see those things in the past, even the burning of coal, and really say, okay, well, what are we doing today? What kind of things are we doing today? How is that similar to or different than what kind of things have happened in the past? And hey, we're people, so we're smart enough to be able to figure it out, not just say, oh, we're just going to just go along with it. We can do something about it, and that's we're very lucky to have that. Dinosaurs didn't. They didn't know anything. The trilobites, they definitely didn't know anything. But we can do something. All right, I want to finish here with a quote by Darwin. This is from pretty much the last line of The Origin of Species. It's a much bigger paragraph. It's a very beautiful paragraph, but it's pretty special because he's talking about how he didn't know what the first life was. He imagined some kind of warm little pond, some kind of cozy little environment where the first life, like bacteria or something like that, could show up. We know today it was not a warm little pond. It would have been something that to us would be very poisonous, but something, that to them, to whatever the first molecules were that began to arrange the first proteins or whatever, would have been a very habitable place. But he did realize that first organisms would have been very simple in a lot of ways, like some kind of bacteria. And from that diversity, and I hesitated to say genetic diversity, but he didn't know anything about genes, so I don't want to say that, but that had the building blocks that everything else has, that everything that came after it was able to have. So all these little pictures of all sorts of life, oh my gosh, all sorts of weird things here. And I do like this, because when we think about animals, what do you think about? Lions, tigers, bears, giraffes, your dog, elephants. You think about zoo animals and like your toys of zoo animals and stuff when you're a kid. This is actually a much better sampling of life on our Earth. So yeah, it's probably still a little biased towards things like mammals. And we have a whale and a fox and a human and a bison. Okay, yeah, we probably do have a few mammals, a few too many mammals here, but we also have, some fungus, we have some bugs, we have some flowers, we have some coral, got some fish, we have all sorts of things. If this was actually pretty accurate, it would probably almost all be bacteria, and then there'd be like one fish in the corner. But anyway, the point is that we do have this huge diversity of life. And it all came from just a few building blocks. And Darwin didn't know anything about how that had happened, really. He didn't know anything about the origins of life, and nothing he really said in The Origin of Species deals with the first life. But we understand now a lot more. But it was Darwin that was going to open that door to our understanding. So anyway, so I hope that was helpful, guys. Thanks a lot. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I'm not going to lecture on everything that we need to know for this class. I'm just going to pick a couple of my favorite topics like this, and hopefully that helps. But there's a whole bunch of videos I'm going to be posting as well, so please watch those because they'll explain things like natural selection, sexual selection, the process of Darwin and Wallace and their discoveries and how they came up with what they did in much better ways than I could. So anyway, thanks a lot, and I hope you guys are taking care. I hate that this is the way I have to teach you because I'd love to answer questions, but again, I have my office hours, so check those out. Email is always fine as well. So thanks a lot. Stay healthy, and I'll see you sometime. Thanks.